U.S. President Donald Trump is in Beijing for a state visit marking the first by an American leader in almost a decade as the world watches for cues on navigating future geopolitics and trade. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Thursday, May 14th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Some pundits claim the thing to watch for during this latest interaction between the leaders of the US and China is the alphabet T in reference to tariffs, trade, tech, Tehran and Taiwan. For more on this, I have Celio Fioretti with French daily Croix here in the studio. Celio, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
I also have Ruy Valdes with Spanish news agency EFE Spain. Ruy, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thanks for the invitation, Sunny.
Celio, we start with you. Let's begin with a recap of the opening remarks by Chinese President Xi Jinping ahead of the closed-door summit that he had with President Donald Trump of the US.
Well, Xi Jinping used his opening remarks to strike a very deliberate and statesman tone. He framed this summit much more than a routine bilateral meeting, saying the whole world was watching because the relationship between China and the United States is what he called is at a new crossroads. The centerpiece of his remarks was his reference to the so-called two cities trap. That is a concept in international relations, suggesting that when a rising power challenge an established power, the result is often war between the two. And by invoking this idea, Xi Jinping was essentially posing the central question of the summit: can China and the United States coexist without falling into that trap, falling into war? And Xi Jinping's answers was quite clear. For him, it's a yes. He said the two countries should be partners rather than enemies, and emphasized that China and the US already cooperate on both sides that would produce benefit for both of them. And whereas confrontation would harm anyone, and obviously not only China and the US, but the rest of the world too. He also stressed that the common interest between the two countries outweighs their differences. So he's clearly opening the doors to Trump. Beyond that bilateral relationship, Xi Jinping cast the summit in global terms. He said that Beijing and Washington should work together to address major international challenges and inject a greater stability and peace in the world. And that was an implicit reference, obviously, to ongoing issues like the war in Iran, trade tension, but also maybe Taiwan, or other maybe some deeper challenges like AI and how can we develop a safe environment for that. So the overall message was cooperation, and really it's an open door for Trump, sort of a strategic restraint, trying to appear like as a promoter of peace for both countries. And China, through that, wants to represent itself as a country that can stabilize the world, and we see there's much more turmoil this year. Try to avoid conflict and establish peace in the world stage.
Right. Ruy, what more can you tell us about the gist of the message shared by US President Donald Trump in response to remarks by his Chinese host Xi Jinping?
Yeah, in a similar positive tone, Trump described friendship with the leader. He described optimism for the future in the relationships of this country, and of course, his usual deal-making type of posture. He personally praised Xi as a great leader. He said that the relationships in the near future, they will be better than ever before. And yeah, but mostly he publicly, at least in the way he treated, since they greeted, the way they handshaked, and it seemed friendly, not trying to impose himself as with other leaders. But at the same time, as you mentioned, the closer meeting, we still don't know the specific results. Some of them we most likely would not know. But what we see publicly is that tone. But the devil is in the details, and of course we need to see what's happened after this.
Right. Celio, as Ruy mentioned, we are still waiting for details of the closed-door discussions that lasted over 2 hours. In the meantime, let's touch upon some of the well-known wants, if you will, of Mr. Trump from China. What do you suppose are his three big wants from China this time around?
Well, essentially, the three major objectives he's pursuing, and with a few secondary goals as well, are quite important. The first and probably the most urgent objective is help on Iran. Trump wants China to use its considerable influence with Tehran to encourage a diplomatic settlement and help bring an end to the ongoing and long-lasting conflict in the Middle East. China is one of Iran's most important economic and political partner. So Beijing is one of the few capitals that may be able to really exert real pressure on the Iranian regime. Whether China is willing to do so is another question, but Trump clearly sees Xi Jinping as a potential ally in that matter. The second major goal is trade and investment deals. Trump wants to secure commitments from China to purchase American products, especially agricultural products such as soybean or grain, but also energy and aerospace products. That's why executives actually from major U.S. companies like Boeing and Cargill are also accompanying Donald Trump to this Beijing visit. The broader objective is to show that his visit can produce real, concrete benefit for the United States. And the third key objective is a strategic stabilization of the world. After years of tariff battles, technology restriction between the two countries, and growing rivalry on topics like AI, for example, and military power too, Trump wants to restore a more open dialogue and negotiating table between U.S. and China. And in other words, he's looking to ease tensions between the two countries and demonstrate that Washington and Beijing can be at the same table and negotiate together and cooperate on issues of global importance. Beyond these three priorities, there's of course the question of Taiwan. It will be addressed, but we don't know exactly in what term. We probably won't know exactly for sure. There's no major breakthrough to expect here, but I think it will be addressed in the joint meeting.
Right. That being said, then, Ruy, what can you tell us about China's wants from Mr. Trump?
Well, yeah, the expectations of many experts, observers, is that Beijing's main goal is to have a greater stability and predictability in the trade relationship with the United States amid as we know, Trump administration's tariffs or different policies that tend to change dramatically from month to month, day to day. And for China, it would be very important to secure some kind of a longer-term agreement. We know in the previous summit that they held here in Busan, they agreed to a one-year trade truce to stop this trade war where they begin to increase the tariffs to very high amounts. And what we believe is that Beijing would aim to get either an extension of this truce or literally an agreement that says that they won't move certain percentage of these tariffs for a longer time. They will, of course, talk in terms of the trade war. The new face of China is also expected. Celio was also explaining a little bit on that. In the opening remarks, President Xi Jinping said that there are no winners in a trade war, showing this new face of China, where now, maybe some years ago, unpredictably, now China seems to be more on the side of free trade against this new style of the Trump administration, where it's trying to protect their own industry and apply these tariffs, as we were mentioning. So yeah, it will be interesting to see the stand or the response also of Trump to these direct comments that he made. But very importantly, Xi Jinping also in the opening remarks, he said that the most important issue in the bilateral relations is the Taiwan issue. And he did address that if there was any mishandling on the issue of Taiwan, this could lead to collision or conflict, which is a strong signal that for sure this will be discussed between the two countries. Trump also said before that he was willing to discuss all the criticism that China has to U.S. in terms of arms sales to Taiwan. We also have, as you mentioned in the opening of the show, technology and market access. China likely will be looking to access the U.S. markets in advanced technologies, semiconductors, and also at the same time from the U.S. side, Trump brought all this delegation with big names, big CEOs of different companies, as he might also expect that in return China will open more. Finally, in terms of Iran, I think that's the grayer area. We still don't know what could come, if they will even publicly talk about if they reach to some kind of deal, because we have seen different signs. China has been critical to U.S. and Israel, but at the same time, China has been critical to the blockade in the Hormuz, especially in areas, an attack, to Gulf countries. So yeah, that part is a little bit gray. A little bit before the start of the show, a Chinese state agency mentioned, according to them, that they also addressed Ukraine and North Korea. But about those things, we can talk a little bit further on.
Right. Celio, 1 week ahead of this US-China summit, Beijing's top diplomat Wang Yi, he played host to Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Could you tell us a bit about that particular encounter and its broader implications?
Well, this meeting between Wang Yi and Abbas Araghchi is widely seen as a highly strategic encounter, both because of its timing and because of what it says about China's role in the Middle East. This was Araghchi's first trip to Beijing since the outbreak of the US-Israel war with Iran, and it took place just 1 week, as you said, before Donald Trump was due to meet Xi Jinping. So the symbolism was important. Iran and China are clearly coordinating their policy and their position ahead of a potential US-China deal on the war in the Middle East. Officially, both sides emphasize that the ceasefire is urgently needed and that negotiation remains the best way forward. Wang Yi described China as a reliable strategic partner of Iran and stressed the importance of restoring safe navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. And that issue is partly important, as we said, for China, which is the world's largest importer of Gulf oil and gas. And analysts say that Beijing overriding priority is stability for its country, for the world. China wants oil tankers moving through the strait without harm, and a prolonged disruption of trade, a prolonged blockade of the Strait of Hormuz could trigger higher inflation in China and in the rest of Asia. And from Iran's perspective, the meeting was also a way to secure maybe a diplomatic backing before any deal, in any renewed talks with Washington. Araghchi called China a close friend, and they are, and said like bilateral cooperation would become even stronger under current circumstances. So the broader implication is that China is trying to position itself as maybe a middleman in the war, as Iran's strategic partner. They can reassure them on some concerns, but also they are the one that will be negotiating and are right now negotiating with the U.S. So they're the sort of the middleman now in this crisis.
Right. Ruy, speaking as a foreign correspondent stationed here in South Korea, what might be on the Xi Jinping administration's radar with regard to the events in Beijing as we speak?
Well, there are several points that I think Li's administration is looking right now how they will be addressed during this summit. One of them is the alliance and security commitments. It could be a concern that in the intention of Trump administrations to get some deals related to security or to get some, let's say, to get China to grant them deals even related to trade of other sorts, they also compromise or reduce or move, I don't know, it could be military troops stationed in some of the middle powers. So South Korea just wants to make sure that at least for their own benefit, this security relation doesn't affect them in a big way. More importantly also is North Korea, and well, the very low possibilities of this of a surprise Trump and Kim Jong-un summit. But as I mentioned, if you see the latest local media, it seems really very low that this will happen. But still, as we know, Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping share, Kim Jong-un was invited as a guest of honor in a very big military parade in China last year. The relations between these two countries have improved a lot. We know at the same time there's this trifecta that we also saw there, Vladimir Putin, and we know that North Korea has sent soldiers to Russia to support them in their war against Ukraine. So all these issues also are important to U.S. And the way they are talked about and the way they are dealt on is something that South Korea will be looking very closely. In terms of Iran, as I mentioned, it would be surprising if we get like an announcement of a big agreement in terms of what's happening in the Middle East. But of course, South Korea is highly concerned about this. Especially, they would want to know if these two superpowers, if we can call them like that, will end up in good terms or in some kind of coincidental terms in how they will address the Iran war. And why is this important to South Korea? Because right now, as we speak, South Korea is revising the recent explosion that happened to a South Korean vote in the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, it has not been confirmed by Seoul who sent these devices to this vote or if this was an attack. But today, Yonhap News did quoted a senior government official saying that there was a very low possibility that this was not an attack by Iran. Still, this is not official information, but South Korea is entangled right now in this issue. So if the results of this summit don't give, let's say, some kind of comfort or optimism on how these two superpowers will address on the war. Of course, South Korea also will dabble more on if, for example, joining this maritime alliance that the U.S. administration proposed to Project Freedom to escort boats through the Strait of Hormuz. So yeah, those will be more or less the topics that Lee's administration should be looking at.
Right. In the meantime then, Celio, for Europe, what are some of its immediate interests with regard to the latest summit between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping?
For Europe, I would say there's three major interests at stake during this summit. First, Europe is watching closely what's happening on trade. Trump has given the European Union until July 4th to conclude a new trade agreement with Washington. Otherwise, European car export could face up to 25% tariff. So if Trump returns from Beijing with a major concession from China, Brussels will worry that he may then turn his attention more aggressively to Europe. But also, at the same time, if the US eases tariff on Chinese goods, that means European manufacturers will have tougher competition for the US market. Those kind of sectors, which is like high technologies, cars, for example, could be facing new pressure from Chinese competitors. Second, Europe is also deeply concerned about technology and artificial intelligence. The United States is tightening export on advanced technologies in semiconductors, for example, or chip-making equipment, including technologies produced by European companies such as ASML, which is the biggest one, the leader in the market. And if Beijing and Washington could end up making a deal, the US and China could end up being the rule makers of the new era of AI, and Europe could be sidelined in that, and Europe could end up being a rule taker rather than a rule maker, and that poses a lot of risk for the European AI industry. And third, European companies are also increasingly caught between the US and Chinese regulation. Washington wants its allies to align stricter with export control, while Beijing has introduced new laws that could penalize foreign firms for complying with those US rules. So that puts European companies and European countries in an extremely difficult position trying to balance an ally, which is the US, and also a market that is China. And both picking a side will, of course, impose retaliation from one on another. So the broader implication of that summit for Europe is that even if Europe is not directly in the summit, implicated in the summit, the outcome could have major consequences for European leaders, for European economy, and European policymakers are really closely watching what's being discussed right now in Beijing.
Which is also the case, I'm sure, for South Korea as well. Ruy, before we end today's talk, and for the sake of some comparison, could you very quickly walk us through the big takeaways from the first summit between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping that took place here in South Korea, in Busan, as you mentioned, in late October, on the margins of the APEC meeting?
Yes, I think many will agree that the main takeaway is that that summit really lowered the temperature between U.S. and China rivalry. At that moment, there was a very strong trade war, as we have been speaking about, and the fact that they got to this one-year truce at least gave a breath, let's say, to international community in terms of the relation of these two countries. Just mentioning some of the main things that were announced back in the day, the U.S. reduced fentanyl-related tariffs, bringing total tariffs on Chinese goods from 57% to 47%. And, well, although I'm talking about more or less the positive things that came from there, or the takeaways, the positive takeaways, I would say that most analysts also agree that it seemed more like a partial freeze or a minor rollback of the rivalry. That's why today's summit is so important for everybody, because we really didn't end up, we ended up, yeah, more like a kind of relaxing from what was going on, but we were not so assured that this was going to be maintained in the long term. And today is this summit happens also while a new conflict arose recently in the Middle East. So well, let's see what happened there. There was also some agreements related to soybeans. China agreed to resume purchases of U.S. soybeans, which was politically important for Trump. Also interesting, as comparison as before to now, that Trump is looking for midterm elections soon. So all these little things, especially in the agricultural sector, can also affect the voters and the results that happen there. One thing that I didn't mention that it was important back then and it's important right now is that is the case of rare earths. China, of course, we know is practically controls the market of rare earths, or is the main country in terms of rare earths. And at that day, back in the day, China agreed to delay export restrictions in these minerals, but still they have so much control in it that today they can still use it as leverage for negotiations. So that will be very interesting to see how it turns out. Technology tensions remain unresolved. Some semiconductors were discussed, but not clearly the Blackwell chips of NVIDIA, which were a big deal last year. And the topic of TikTok also was on the agenda, but was not clearly resolved. And lastly, Taiwan was notably absent. And that's also the big question here. They did mention it in the opening remarks, but we have to see how they will address it, or if they will publicly tell us what they discussed.
Right, especially since they'll be having more talks, of course, following their first summit for this particular session. They have more talks scheduled for tomorrow, Friday, as well. All right, Ruy, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks,
Celio, thank you very much for your insights. Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to join us again same time tomorrow.